Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We're going to wait a couple more seconds to let folks get oriented and get logged in, but excited to see folks joining us already. Hope everyone's having a nice summer wherever you're joining us from. And if you're interested in sharing, we'd love to know where you're joining us from. If you want to put in the chat what state you're coming from, or maybe tell us about whatever co-ops you're involved in. We're always excited to see what co-ops are being represented on these calls. But I wanted to also say hello and welcome. This is the Member-Centric Governance and Cooperatives webinar. My name is Emma McCormick, and I'm the Senior Director of Engagement at National Farmers Union. Joining me today is NFU's Education Coordinator, Lisa Buckner. Lisa and I are going to be your moderators, and so if you need anything, feel free to just reach out to us in the chat. We'll make sure to do our best to help you. Our host today is Urban Crowell, who serves on the Board of Directors of the New England Farmers Union and is Executive Director of the Neighboring Food Co-op Association. Joining us is our guest speaker, Karen Miner. Karen is the Managing Director at the International Center for Cooperative Management at St. Mary's University. Very excited to have you with us today, Karen. Next slide, please, Urban. Before we dive into today's topic, I wanted to review some Zoom housekeeping. We will be taking time at the end of the webinar to answer any questions, but you're welcome to drop those into the Q&A box throughout the presentation. The Q&A box and the chat box are located at the bottom of your screen. We are recording this presentation and we'll post a copy for you to review at a later date. We are also recording all the chats, so if there are any unanswered questions, we will be able to capture them and hopefully answer them in a future webinar. Slide, please. If you are unfamiliar with National Farmers Union, our mission is to advocate for family farmers, ranchers through education, legislation, and cooperation. NFU is a grassroots organization, and we work on a wide variety of issues that affect American family farmers and rural residents. We encourage you to check out our website at nfu.org and explore the opportunities to become involved in our organization. I think that's it for me. So Urban, I'm going to turn it over to you and Karen, and let's get rolling.
Great, thank you, Emma. And thank you, Karen, for joining me. As Emma mentioned, this series builds on the Farmers Union's cooperative legacy with a goal of strengthening awareness of the importance of cooperative enterprise, not just for our rural communities, but across our economy, as well as the relevance of the co-op business model as we work to rebuild better from the impacts of the pandemic and other challenges that we face today. Of course, co-ops continue to play a pivotal role in rural America. For example, co-ops were crucial to connecting communities to electricity in the 30s and continue to power more than half of the US landmass. The majority of family farmers are members of at least one co-op, enabling them to work together to compete with much larger corporations. And co-ops have been particularly successful in areas of farm credit and insurance. It's also important to note that while co-ops are not generally taught about in our colleges and universities, they have a profound impact on our economy and communities around the world. For example, 1 in 3 Americans and 1 billion people worldwide are co-op members. Co-ops employ more than multinational firms, and co-ops are not just successful, but also innovative and can play a key role in helping us to rebuild the economy and build back better. The co-op model is also extremely flexible and can be used across the economy. In a lot of these presentations, we try to tailor them in a way so that the information is useful across sectors and industries, because we want to demonstrate how co-ops can be used in a variety of ways to help people to work together to meet their needs and root economic infrastructure in their communities. So as just a reminder, to date, we've been working on, I guess it's 5 sessions so far. All of these are posted on the Farmers Union's YouTube channel, including an introduction to the cooperative movement, growing cooperative enterprise, Rochdale and the early cooperative movement, the evolution of the cooperative identity, and a session on credit unions, which are cooperative financial institutions. And as I mentioned, all these sessions are available on the Farmers Union YouTube channel. But for today, we really want to focus in on governance and cooperatives, and we want to specifically look at how successful models of governance can be member-centric in their orientation. There are a lot of resources out there for people wanting to learn more about the different roles and responsibilities within sort of formal governance structures of cooperatives. But with Karen's help, we want to take a little bit of a deeper look into the importance of context for co-ops, offer some case studies of co-ops that engage their members in the governance and operation of the entity in ways beyond simply electing the board, and then make sure we have some time for your questions and feedback and even ideas for future presentations. So what do we mean by governance? For the purpose of our presentation, I want to quote Karen and her colleague Sonia Novkovich from one of the resources that we'll offer at the end of the presentation. Broadly speaking, we're concerned with the relationship of governance to vision, decision-making processes, power dynamics, and accountability practices, with the ultimate goal of governance being to effectively fulfill an organization's goals in a way consistent with the organization's purpose. Now, when we look at questions of enterprise governance, in a conventional corporation, the typical governance chart is fairly straightforward in framing the purpose and flow of decision-making. Ownership and control is by capital or investors, the owners of the enterprise, which then appoint a board of directors, which hires management, which hires and supervises employees, with the primary goal of generating financial return on invested capital. This is a little bit of a simplistic chart, but this is what you'll see out there in a lot of business literature. And you'll also see a similar chart in a lot of literature on cooperative governance. And there are plenty of resources out there that are very useful, and especially in terms of thinking about roles and responsibilities, but they essentially follow this basic model when discussing co-ops by simply replacing the owners or investors at the top of the chart with co-op members. And then under this model, members establish the purpose of the co-op, control it by electing a board of directors in a democratic fashion. The board then provides strategy and oversight, usually hires management to conduct planning, coordinate employees, who then implement these plans and conduct operations to meet the needs and goals established by the members. Now, as I mentioned, this can be a very useful tool, particularly in terms of clarifying roles and responsibilities, creating clean lines between who does what. But what I think the challenge with it is that it leaves out one of the basic distinctions of the cooperative model, which is that co-ops exist to benefit members as active users or patrons of the enterprise, rather than simply as owners, investors, or shareholders. And the importance for rural communities of this model is recognized by the USDA in its support of cooperative enterprise and its definition of co-ops as user-owned businesses that are controlled by and operate for the benefit of their members, rather than outside investors. So rather than having a linear governance structure, what I'd like to propose is that co-ops are more accurately described by a circular structure in which the people who actively use the enterprise are also its members. They exercise democratic control over it. And the interest of these people can be described by their primary economic relationship with the co-op. In basic terms, a co-op may be organized around the interest of its members, for example, as employees who conduct the operations of the business and are using it to secure a livelihood and fulfilling work, or producers who use it to process and market their raw materials together, or consumers who use the business to secure desired products and services. While it's not the focus of our presentation today, we did want to note multi-stakeholder or solidarity co-ops can include some combination of member classes, as well as other cooperatives and organizations. But where we do want to focus is case studies that illustrate a deeper level of member engagement and governance beyond simply electing a board. It's also useful to note that while basic definitions of use and patronage help us understand the primary relationship of members to their co-op, in practice, the purposes identified by members often reach far beyond the individual benefit that they might derive. This unique relationship is enshrined in the cooperative identity, which defines co-ops as entities that exist to enable people to work together to meet their common economic, social, and cultural needs and aspirations. Not only that use relationship, right? For example, many farmer co-ops have a much broader vision than just benefiting their individual members. Their goal might be creating vibrant rural economies, ensuring that family farmers can survive in this economy. It could relate to sustainability. Our food co-ops, for example, in my association, while most of them are consumer-based, the purposes and outcomes that they've identified reach far beyond being able to access healthy food, right? They prioritize supporting local producers. They want to provide good jobs. They want to support environmental sustainability. So while that use relationship is important, I think it's also important to recognize that members generally often want more than just that use relationship in terms of outcomes produced by the cooperative. This is also reflected in the cooperative values, which emphasize ideals of collective self-help, democracy, equality, equity, and solidarity, as well as benefiting the wider community and not just the members of the cooperative. And the cooperative principles, of course, are the guidelines by which co-ops put these values into practice. And we can see the relevance to cooperative governance in most, if not all, of these principles, right? For example, open membership calls on us to ensure that membership is accessible rather than exclusive. Democratic control is vested in the members of the enterprise who actively participate in the co-op. And this control should be independent of the influence of governments, outside investors, nonprofits, or other non-member organizations. Ongoing education training has long been recognized as essential to ensuring that members can effectively participate in governance, and cooperation among cooperatives emphasizes that the interest of members is best served by working together with other co-ops to share information, strategies, achieve economies of scale, and support cooperative development and expansion. And finally, again, concern for community speaks to members supporting sustainable development of the wider community and the co-op as a multi-generational social and economic asset, not just the property of the current members. And so with that introduction, I hope I've set a good intro there for Karen to then dive into sort of the intricacies of the cooperative enterprise model, the importance of context, and then some case studies that can help us see how a member-centric approach to governance can take place. Karen.
Thanks, Irvin. In the chat, I just put a link to the International Center for Cooperative Management. We'll try to share links as we go as well. But just, again, I'm happy to join you from, in this case, Canada, but given I work within an international center, we're thinking about all types of co-ops in all contexts all over the world and have very strong relationships in particular with the United States. So pleasure to be here virtually to talk a bit more about cooperatives. And I'm going to say a few things about what you see on the screen in terms of an enterprise model before narrowing in on the governance aspects. So we like to think of the cooperative enterprise model as the way that co-ops operationalize the cooperative identity that Urban just went over in terms of the purpose, values, and principles that we all hold in common. And that is the center of this model. Member centricity is fundamental. And it was already described as members as having this user relationship who then own, collectively, control, typically one member, one vote, and benefit economically based on their usage, but also benefit is understood to be more than just financial return. So that understanding of usership as a relationship does translate nicely into the key differentiating characteristics that we should all be keeping in mind when we're thinking about our enterprises as collectively owned and controlled by members, democratically governed by members, and people-centered, which includes members that actively use the organization, but it also should be thought of to go further, to acknowledge the importance of all of our strategic stakeholders, because again, you'll have your particular membership group, but there are equally other stakeholders that you may not have in your membership, but you need to still apply the same values to those groups, such as employees, suppliers, customers, producers, community, and going beyond people to include nature and the natural environment. So that's just some brief on how we conceptualize the enterprise model. Urban, the next slide is a nice way to then think and build on that previous image. So if we unpack this and look at what does alignment mean versus misalignment with the co-op identity and the enterprise model. Misalignment is not representative of a co-op. So if you see these features in your co-op, you do and should make some changes. But it is helpful sometimes to think about the other end of the spectrum, what we're trying not to be. So as discussed, co-ops are member user focused. So we're not shareholder investor focused. We're people centered. Other end of the spectrum is capital centered. That's not us. We should be feeling that we are relational and participatory, that we don't feel that our organizations are focused on a transactional mindset or a market exchange mentality or a situation where we don't give voice to the users. We want to be thinking about the real economy and the real total costs of our activities. So that tends to be where we see ourselves being more about local, more about direct versus distance, commodification, or market-based ways of thinking and acting. And then something that's very special in terms of the co-op way is our networked features. So thinking about Principle 6, cooperation among co-ops, and how we move beyond our one individual co-op to think about our relationships among co-ops, but also how we interact at the level of associations and federations, and that we see all this happening from local to global. And then lastly, that we're aiming to be intergenerational. We're here stewarding what you might call an intergenerational asset. So that leads us to really think long-term versus misalignment would be if you were thinking short-term, you're thinking just about profit or profit maximization. So the next slide is where we move into, okay, keeping all of that in mind, the broad cooperative identity, as Urban described it, this conceptual idea of an enterprise model, what we're looking for when we say it's aligned, and then what role does governance play in that, and what does the governance system look like? So let's talk about that a bit. First of all, we've been discussing the importance of cooperative type, which means the member user piece. So that first column you see where it says membership and then co-op type. So what is yours? Is it worker? Is it producer? Is it consumer? Is it multi-stakeholder? And within that, what are the different membership categories? This factor has a very strong influence on the resulting governance system in a cooperative. And secondly, the second column is that context matters. And we look at a few factors that have particular impact on the governance. So how do you articulate the purpose, why you exist as a cooperative? And next is stakeholders. So I was talking about people-centered. If you are a worker co-op, well, presumably you do think about your consumers or you think about your producers. If you're a producer co-op, you're thinking about the other categories as well as the other stakeholders I mentioned. Also, size of your organization and stage in life cycle. So are you a startup? Have you been around for a while? Have you been around so long that you actually feel like you're very different from when you started? So those are the contextual factors that we focus on when we think about governance and some of the major levers that might change how the last column, which is the system. We break that down in terms of it being made up of structures, processes, and dynamics. And I'll just touch on that on the next slide. And don't worry, I'm going to get into some examples. This is supposed to set the stage, but it's quite contextual and conceptual in terms of at least a model to then talk about what this looks like in practice. So with structures, processes, and dynamics, starting with structures, these tend to be somewhat intuitive. It's how when we look at how we do governance, particular picking up on the second bullet, we think about our decision-making bodies. So what do you have in place? Is it just a board of directors? Do you have boards, other committees, councils, other ways that you've structured engagement from membership? You'll have legal structures in place that then result in your bylaws, the policies you put in place within your organization. It is those sorts of things we think about in terms of structures and how you structure the ownership and control aspects of your co-op. Secondly is processes. So we know that voice by your user members is a membership right. So you need to have processes in place to ensure that that is available and it's strong. Democracy. When you think back to the model from a few slides ago, democratic governance is a key characteristic of co-ops, but democracy can be done in different ways. So how is the process of democracy put in place in your co-op? And then lastly, decision-making processes. So how do you make decisions? There aren't rules and only one way to do this in any cooperative organization. So how is that done in your organization? Is it majority vote? Is it consensus? Is it consent? Is it some combination of those things depending on the type of decision? And lastly, dynamics. This is to acknowledge that things change over time. So we need to be aware of both what's going on inside our organization and also what's going on outside of our organization and how those things may interrelate and may affect our organizations. Be willing to know what those are and adapt and change over time. And sometimes those dynamics can really create pressure on the cooperative enterprise model and cause us to drift away from the way we should be governing our organizations or otherwise operationalizing our enterprise model. So we need to be aware of that so that we can identify it and find ways to maintain strong co-ops. So the next slide is where I move into some cases. We've been developing over the last couple of years a series of case studies, and we're still working on some, so there are more to come. We are trying to highlight best cooperative governance across different types of co-ops. So far, they're primarily in the Americas and Europe, but there are more to come. And it's trying to showcase success stories where you see that the cooperative enterprise model is kept strong. So it's regeneration versus degeneration. We're not so much interested in focusing on those stories that aren't the things that other co-ops should be emulating. So first, let's just look at the next slide that shows a number of logos for worker co-ops. So if you remember back from the governance 3 pillars where I talked about membership, then context, then structures, processes, and dynamics, that first one was saying membership is a key almost entry into how you might then imagine different governance systems. So what I'm breaking down here is some of the major types. We'll start with worker co-ops as a member type. And while there's a lot of diversity on this slide, and there are cases for some of these, both as standalone cases on our website, but also in a forthcoming book on humanistic governance and co-ops, there'll be some of the other ones featured. I'm going to focus right now on Unicorn. So Unicorn, moving to the next slide, Urban, is a multi-award-winning worker cooperative whole foods retailer. It has approximately 70 members, worker members, and 8 million pounds sterling, so it's in the United Kingdom, in annual sales. It was established in 1996 to address local nutritional needs. And it, from the get-go, and this was column 2, in terms of the purpose of the enterprise, has a very strong alignment with cooperative identity, what we would label as a true complex purpose for the organization, not just focusing on the economic needs of their members for work, but going much deeper into trying to engage with other aspects of social purpose, environmental sustainability, and on and on. And this is demonstrated in their operationalization of values through external partnerships to wage solidarity and many other activities. Their governance structure is in stark contrast to what you might expect as a standard top-down corporate governance model. So some of what Urban showed earlier, when it can fit into what you nicely look at as an organizational structure. So instead, what you see on the screen, and I know you can't read the details of all of these circles, but there is a full case on this, so you can go and read about it in detail and look at each of the circles. So it's a circular model that is referred to as a flat networked form of sociocratic governance. So at the biggest circle is the general meeting, where there are opportunities for all members to come together. Then within it, you see 3 groupings of circles. So it's where you have circles within a grouping called governance, another operations and sales, and then a third purchasing logistics. There are 20 circles in total, plus this forum in the middle that almost acts as an interconnection between those 3 bigger circles in between general meetings. And they use both consent as a mode of democracy in those teams and circles, and then what they call a modified consensus when it comes to the general meeting, where all the members come together for big decisions. So frankly, if you aren't familiar with this idea of circles and sociocracy, this would seem quite new to you. For those that do operate with this type of governance, it is something that many cooperatives, and in particular on the worker co-op side, have become more comfortable with and you see more of. So something to dig into in more detail if your interest is piqued, or perhaps there's someone that called that already practiced sociocracy. The next slide is where we transition to second tier and federation co-op cases. Just a few, again, logos up here to say cases exist and will exist. We're working closely with some folks at Lenki, which is a research and education institute at Mondragon University, to work on some multi-stakeholder co-op cases for Mondragon. But today, one case that was recently finished is on SAOS. So the next slide is on SAOS, which is the Scottish Agriculture Organisation Society. It's a co-op federation. It was established in 1905. It's now comprised of approximately 56 primary agricultural co-ops. The group's turnover is about 4.5 million pounds sterling, and the federation has 31 staff. So this federation or association has some of what you'd expect as the usual benefits: networking, lobbying, information exchange, group marketing. But they also are very strong in providing education, doing consultation, digital technology, supply chain work, and natural environment work. In terms of governance, I'm just going to hit on a couple of things. One, to emphasize what we like to call networked governance, and they do some of that. You can see on the slide where there's stakeholder engagement beyond just the board of directors, the standard board of directors, and the management under them. They have a two-tiered structure. So they have a council sitting above the board of directors, which has 26 people on it, and it acts as a supervisory forum from the membership and other invited stakeholders into that group. And then the board itself is 10, drawing on the council and some other positions for non-council members. They also have regional networking forums. You can see off to the side where they're engaging and bringing together groups of managers, groups of chairs, groups of staff from their membership. So various ways to engage at multiple levels and out to their bigger membership. Another unique feature of SAOS is their strength of Principle 5, education and training. So this is something they focus a lot on, both at the federation level and directly within the primary members, to make sure everyone deeply understands the cooperative enterprise model, the directors, the staff, and the managers, so at all levels. And lastly, just to flag that SAOS really is focused on the dynamic side and the importance of that in terms of just the operation of agriculture generally, but also in terms of how you integrate that into governance. So if you talk to anyone from SAOS, they'll very quickly be talking about climate change and climate crisis, agricultural innovation, data revolution. So you can see even on the slide where it flags a couple of initiatives that they've taken on, which are quite significant. Just to touch on Scott EID, that's their data co-op focused on livestock traceability, and having recently been on a webinar that featured their deputy CEO for SAOS and the head of Scott EID, Bob Buell, he was really flagging how member engagement is a key piece of that, which we might not think about. It's about data, it's about for your members. But he had flagged that every month they'll talk to over 4,000 of their 23,000 members, as he called it, under that Scott EID. So engagement with people in that relational aspect through something like Scott EID is really excellent. I'm going to move on to a producer co-op case example. And if you feel like with these examples, that you're, what would you call it, drinking from a fire hose, please go read the case. They're very easy to read. They're really interesting. They're not written in an academic or research way. So I do encourage you, if any of these are saying, I want to know more about what that means or what is done, then take the time to go download. They're freely available on our website, any of these cases. So Agropur, this is a recent case that was also completed. It's featuring Agropur, which was established in 1938 by 87 farmers in Quebec, Canada. Currently, their sales in Canadian dollars are $7.7 billion. So that was in 2020. They have 2,974 members today based in Canada, and they're the largest dairy processing cooperative in North America, ranked 16th among the world's largest dairy processors. So they're of a significant size. When it comes to the cooperative itself, this idea of having an economic relationship with their members is combined with members being committed through a democratic governance structure that promotes participation and information exchange. So when you look at the screen, you can see two structures side by side. They have a democratic structure, but they also have what they call an animation structure, or I sometimes use the word facilitation structure. And those two structures are side by side and interconnected, where in many co-ops, we might only see the democratic structure. So I think what's unique about Agropur is you can see how much is going on and how there are opportunities for different members that have an interest perhaps in engaging in different ways or have different needs, have many ways to do that. So to break that down a little bit, on the democratic structure side, you see members, delegates, regional meetings, annual meetings, and the board of directors. That, from my experience, is a fairly typical structure in cooperatives, not only producer or agriculture, but in cooperatives that use a delegate structure. In this case, they have 10 different regions of approximately 300 members each. And their regional meetings have a participation rate of about 25%. Actually consider that not high, but that is one feature of their structure, and that's the current participation rate. Then from those regional meetings, there are delegates, of which there's one for each 10 members in the region. And those delegates go to the AGM, and they have a participation rate of about 70% of elected delegates that attend the General Assembly. Their board itself is 10 members, one from each of those regions that is elected into the board, plus they have 3 at-large seats elected by all delegates present at the AGM, and one of those at-large seats is a young director position, so someone under the age of 35. That position was created in 2019. Plus, they also have 3 non-voting independent directors. So those are non-member directors, but do note that they had also made the decision they're non-voting, but they otherwise have just as much involvement in the board activities as the elected member directors. It allows them to bring in outside expertise and industry expertise. So just to speak for a minute about the animation structure, which is what you see on the other side, this acts in parallel with the traditional elective structure to provide a structure and associated processes for member engagement. Again, I'm emphasizing we have structures and we have processes going on here, back to what we said is part of the governance system. And so from their perspective, based on the International Cooperative Alliance's principle of education, training, and information, the purpose of this structure is to inform and consult members while maintaining an active associative life. So this animation structure was created in 1949 under the responsibility of the Solidarity Committee, which is a committee of the board. So it's comprised of all elected member directors. And it's supported by the Senior Vice President of Cooperative Affairs and the Director of Cooperation. So the role of the committee is to manage associative life and to promote cooperation within Agropur and its community of members. So I just really love how they have all these layers of committees and roles that are integrated and emphasize the importance of the member engagement aspect. So the components of this animation structure below the Solidarity Committee include facilitators. So you see that on the screen. Facilitators are actually member producers, so members of the co-op, that are chosen among their peers to support the associative life, and they aim to keep Agropur's vibrant membership relationship alive. And then you see advisors there sideways. So this is a service that's provided free of charge to members. These are actually salaried staff members within the organization with a background in agronomy, and their primary task is to support the work of the producers in 2 ways. They provide support through cooperative education and training, so that's on governance of the co-op, the role of members, the history of Agropur and its strategic evolution. And secondly, dairy producer professional information. So the transfer of knowledge on specific subjects related to the business, like milk quality and sustainable agriculture. So I just really do think that there's something to this Agropur one when you think of such a large cooperative, such high sales and revenue and number of members, and then these two parallel structures really helping to maintain that strong governance system and link to membership. So Urban, I'm going to move on to the last case study.
I was just going to mention a parallel on this that from a consumer co-op perspective, Rabobank, my memory has a sort of a similar structure, parallel structure to its local entities. So that might be an interesting one to bring up from a consumer. And it's also huge. That's what made me think of it. It's another gigantic financial cooperative.
Great. Yeah, I think again, there are various ones that would be interesting to map out that, again, when you have federation structures as well, like this being primary producers, there's no other layer in there, but others that are more federated where you might have independent co-ops joining, you often see the delegate structures. And I personally think it's an interesting thing for all co-ops to think about, especially larger consumer co-ops where we tend to go from a large membership base to an apex board. And I'm not often seeing enough process and structures in between that say, how are you engaging and providing opportunities for your membership in between those two levels?
Right.
So I am going to move on to a consumer co-op case study example. And this is on OAS FCU. So the OAS Federal Credit Union is US based. It was established in 1962 to serve financial needs of employees that were new to the country or lacked financial history and needed access to financial services. So today it's 8,000 to 9,000 members worldwide, with the headquarters in Washington, DC, and approximately, and we did this case a couple years ago, so the number may have gone up, but at that time, 250 million in assets. So a few things to highlight with OAS FCU is that they have a very strong purpose and ethos that's tied to the co-op identity. So thinking back to that enterprise model where there's purpose, values, and principles in the middle, that's really a core piece that you need strong to make the other parts work. So OAS FCU is committed to living up to the ICA co-op identity. I would say they seem to have a leadership and cultural alignment with that, and quite a link to Latin American context. So this view of understanding what solidarity economics means. This underpins the mindset of the members, the staff, and the outside stakeholders that participate in OAS FCU. As for their structure for the governance, they have a board of directors. So on the surface, you might look at this and go, okay, they have a board and they have committees. But then when you look at that a little more closely, aside from those elected as board members, at the committee level, they engage a total of approximately 60 other members that aren't elected into those committees. So rather than only populating their board committees with board members, it's an opportunity to bring in other members to serve on those committees. So the credit committee and the board are elected by the members, and that's required. But otherwise, with those other members sitting on committees, you have one board member and the rest are committee members that are drawn from the board or drawn from the larger membership. And this was established a decade or more ago as an approach to bridge between members, the community, and their credit union. To add to that, because you might think, well, how do you just bring people onto these committees? Sure, that's great. You have an opportunity to have more people around the table, more ways to engage more people. But a layer they've added on, which I think is quite useful, is a leadership program. So if you're part of that group of members that sit on committees but weren't elected onto the board, they're developing the next generation of leaders through a leadership program. And this intends to promote and enhance the volunteers' potential for contribution to the board, to committees, and to other activities. They structure this leadership program into 4 pillars. So it's about the individual, it's about interpersonal, it is about the credit union itself, and then about the broader credit union industry and broader cooperative sector. So it's also a great benefit, I would think, for those individual members that have drawn themselves into these structures and then can benefit from this leadership program, which stretches over a couple of years. This isn't just a weekend program. And this idea of bringing broad member engagement into it through this committee structure allows them to have some obvious benefits of new ideas, hearing about different interests, different perspectives, bringing the concerns of a broader group of members to the credit union governance structure. Often with consumer cooperatives, there can be this sense of distance between your broader members and then those that are governing, those that are setting the strategic direction. And this is one way to at least engage some others in that. And of course, they do some of the other typical ways. But these people, so if there were 60 people and plus your board of directors, when they have their annual strategic planning retreat, everyone is invited, including all of the staff. So it also is something that has opened up the possibility for input from a broader group of members within their structure. So that was it for OAS. However, again, the longer story is available in the full case, as well as, and it will be flagged at the end, but a few years ago, we wrote a piece called Diversity and Governance for the Cooperative Business Journal, which is out of NCBA CLUSA, and OAS FCU is a very short version of that case is featured in that article. So we're moving into wrap up, and then we'll open it up for questions and comments. So just casting our mind back to where I started with the enterprise model and then a little bubble diagram with the 3 columns. It's just to say that your governance system and its alignment to the cooperative enterprise model actually matters. So starting with that identity piece with the purpose, values, and principles, if you're not strong there, then the rest is probably going to fall apart. You need to be thinking about those fundamental pieces and the strength of your alignment with them, and then build your governance system from that point. Context does matter. As we sometimes say, when you've met one co-op, you've met one co-op. You know, there is not a one size fits all, but that's not an excuse to be misaligned. You saw the things that we don't want to be. How do we make sure we're aligned? Being aligned means also aligned with our cooperative identity, the elements that show up in this enterprise model, and thinking about our member type as an entry point into what's probably going to make sense for our co-op governance system. And then the other key factors that were flagged in the middle. How deeply are we aligned in terms of our co-op purpose? What is our size? What is our industry? What's going on in our context, in our environment? And then the resulting, hopefully strong component parts of the structure, processes, and dynamics of our system itself. So the last content slide is really to say, here's a best co-op governance cheat sheet. So if you were going to go and look at how is governance done in your cooperative, what is that system of governance? And you went through a list like this, which we're not going to go through in detail now. It is what we have talked about throughout this, but you would expect to see these things in place. Not the verses, you are networked, you are democratic, you are relational. And sort of that last bullet in bold is again reiterating the fact that you need clarity amongst those that are the members and the management, perhaps, if they're separate, your members, your management, the people that are both operationalizing what comes out of your governance system, those that are setting the path for your co-op, that everyone's on the same page, that there's clarity of what we are as co-ops, what our identity is, what our purpose is as an enterprise, that we value having participatory governance systems, that we understand that decision-making is democratic. And typically principle 5 needs to come in play here, education, training, and information, because this is not always the default position that people have come into co-ops with if they are deeply steeped in it, but it's a place we need to get everyone to so we can continue to have strong alignment with the core characteristics of the enterprise model and ensure that we will have intergenerational cooperatives going forward. So Urban, there, I'm wrapping up and handing it back to you.
No, that was great. I guess the point that I was going to make there is I feel like often in a competitive environment, it can be tempting for co-ops to not invest in these different characteristics of their model at that crucial time when they should be, because it's the cooperative characteristics that their competitors can't mimic that are going to enable them to compete better. And that's a challenging dynamic that we see a lot, and it can feel counterintuitive to say, well, actually we need to invest more heavily in participation at a time when we are feeling pressured as an enterprise. But I think in order to take advantage of the co-op difference, you have to accept that core purpose as also your core strength and invest in it as heavily as you can in order to compete, survive, thrive, and serve your members over time. So that was awesome. Thank you. And we did reserve some good time for question and feedback. And Emma, do you want to pick up here?
Thank you. I am going to let Lisa do the questions in a second, but before we get there, really wanted to say thank you to Karen and Irvin for this presentation today. This was really informative, and I'm glad we were able to have this conversation. And for those of you who are interested, this again will be recorded. We've been capturing all those great resources that Irvin and Karen have been both mentioning and putting in the chat. So those will come out in an email in the next couple of days. But Lisa, how are those questions looking?
We have one question so far. Shannon is wondering if either of you have any additional takeaways for members in co-ops that are also nonprofits, and she gives energy co-ops as an example.
Well, I don't know if you have thoughts on this, Karen. The first question I would just want to clarify. What I would state is that all co-ops are not necessarily nonprofit, but they are not for profit and share the same basic economic structure with energy co-ops. What can be very different about energy or utility co-ops is that they are, how to describe it, they're more geographical in membership pool than they are in sort of that optional user relationship, right? And so I think one of the challenges that energy co-ops can face, if I'm talking about the right type of energy co-op, which is sort of utility, and you can let me know, Shannon, if I'm on the right track here or not. But one of the challenges is that people within that area, my family, my father's family is from the Panhandle of Texas, which has a lot of electric co-ops, telephone co-ops. And the challenge is they're sort of taken for granted by the members because they're sort of treated as a utility instead of, oh, I went out of my way to join this energy co-op and therefore I am going to take the time to be an engaged member. And so I think energy co-ops in that position almost have to invest even more heavily on member engagement because there's not a lot of reason in your day-to-day use of that co-op to be engaged, right? And so how can an energy cooperative think about both engaging its members and users in the current products and services it provides, how they might be shifted or improved in a way that serves the co-op better, for example, sustainability, not just expense, but also ability to serve members over time? Or are there ways to engage members in other types of services? And I think one of the ones that we've seen a lot recently is, for example, broadband. There are a lot of energy and utility co-ops that have infrastructure that can be used to serve their members in new and, I guess, non-traditional ways, right? They can easily get stuck in, oh, we're just delivering electricity and that's what we do and we're kind of going to stop there. But I do think there's an opportunity to engage members more deeply in how that co-op and its infrastructure can serve its wider community even more effectively. And I think there's an opportunity in terms of a lot of the structures that Karen just shared, that members could be involved in sort of unexpected ways in making the co-op more relevant to the communities. I don't know if you want to add anything on that, Karen.
Not particularly. I had the same question or clarification that you raised at the beginning. I suppose that flagging that when we think about the spectrum between multi-stakeholder, worker, producer, consumer co-ops typically are the ones that struggle the most to find ways to create strong levels of connection and engagement and participation with their members. So that might be a takeaway, knowing that that's not an excuse, not to think about how you could be creative, how you could create structures and processes to build that more in and see what happens. It may take some time if there isn't much there at present. If it is, and I don't know your circumstance, but if it is that you have a fairly large membership and then you have very few people interested in being on the board, or you have a board of directors that hasn't changed much over time, or you don't have many people voting or showing up at the AGM. I mean, these are typical stories we sometimes hear of what's happening in consumer co-ops, but a commitment to wanting to change that doesn't mean we should always be measuring success based on the number of people that vote or the number of people that show up at AGMs. We sometimes limit our imagination when it comes to how we measure member engagement with those two criteria. Those are important, but you may see those improve if you find other ways to interest your members in the associative life and engaging them, not just as customers. Because I know, as we discussed earlier, the member-user relationship is almost the entry criteria to be associated with a co-op, but with consumer co-ops as well, when we think about governance, it isn't so much that user relationship that you're engaging with when it comes to governance. You want to find ways to find out how interested people may be if you start to give them voice and representation and engagement in the bigger questions and the strategic direction. So I could say a lot about this, clearly, but if your members are pretty unaware, then it's a big leap to then expect to have a participatory and engaged structure. There's quite a bit of work to be done in the interim to even make them aware that's an option for them, because they may be quite unaware of their rights and responsibilities as members, first and foremost.
Right.
Thank you, Urban and Karen, for answering that. We have another question here. Someone asks, how have multi-stakeholder or consumer co-ops handled employees serving in governance roles?
I mean, do you want to take a first shot at this one, Karen? Do you have any? I mean, I've said a couple thoughts, but maybe you have something from some recent research. Not necessarily.
Well, it's interesting because I sometimes find this, I'd love to know, you always want to hear a little more about what's the perspective of that question in terms of, is it a fear of having worker voice around the table, or that worker, it's sometimes it's this idea of, not to sound academic about it, but the principal agent problem, like we can't have workers at the table because they need to be workers and not engaged in governance. But if you're multi-stakeholder co-op, so how have the multi-stakeholder consumer co-ops? Well, if your multi-stakeholder co-op has workers as a category of membership, well, then clearly they have a right to be engaged and part of the governance structure and roles. Consumer co-ops, you see that less so. I mean, I know, Urban, you can speak to a few examples, perhaps in the food co-op structures, but it's always tricky when you're engaging people that don't have a member role in your governance, and then figuring out how you clarify that role and why you have them there, and not always, again, it's back to creativity. It may not be in the board structures, it may be in committee structures, it may be in other ways, it may be in worker councils that then have a direct link up to the governance structures. So it's thinking around the edges, especially if we have a very traditional structure in place. Well, we can't always jam everything into that. We need to think of the other pieces we should be putting into the puzzle if we're wanting to, for instance, give workers more of a voice, whether it's in operations or governance, frankly. Urban, over to you.
Right. Well, so we have thought about this a lot in our association, and one of the, the starting point for us was thinking that membership is a competitive advantage for a cooperative. And to the degree that even in a consumer co-op, employees think of our members, even if they might receive patronage based on their purchases instead of their labor, that's an advantage, because you have staff that are thinking in terms of being members that have a stake in the long-term success of the entity, and not just an employment relationship. And so one thing we started doing was, when we survey our member food co-ops, we started asking them what portion of their employees are also members. And we got a lot of really interesting responses, all the way from 100% of them membership is actually a benefit of an employment in the co-op, and when somebody's hired, they get a membership, to I never even thought about that. And maybe we should be doing orientations to our employees about what it means to be a member. So even in a consumer-based co-op, I think there's an opportunity to engage employees as members. Now, to take it a little further, I think that there's an opportunity with a multi-stakeholder structure, because what you're saying to this other group of members is, we're acknowledging you have a unique relationship with the cooperative as an employee, and that's what your membership should be based on. You bring a wealth of knowledge, perspective, and ideas to the table that we want in governance. That goes back to that last bullet on that slide we had before, where in those cases, it's very important to be very clear about your purpose, right? Your purpose is to be multi-stakeholder. You have clarity on governance structures. What's a governance decision versus operational decision? You have a clear understanding of around education and training to really equip all members, not just employee members, but consumer members as well, to be effective, engaged, and committed participants in effective governance for success, right? All of those things need to be treated as an asset in order for those structures to succeed, right? If the organization is not aligned and committed to having employees at the table in that manner, it's probably not going to work very well. So it needs to be aligned around this is a competitive advantage for us, and it will support the success of our co-op to have employees engaged in this manner. And therefore, we are going to create the following structures to make it work well.
Thank you both for taking some time to answer those questions. I know there's a few more in the chat, but we're coming to the top of the hour, and I think we still have a couple more slides to get through.
We have a few brief slides. We can go through this one quickly since it'll be in the recording, and I think a couple of these things went in the chat. So just a few more resources for folks who want to dig in deeper on governance topics. Did want to mention that coming up July 2nd is the 100th International Day of the Cooperatives, which just to again point to the influence of co-ops. This is an international celebration acknowledged by the United Nations. It's a global recognition of the importance of cooperatives. So Emma just put in the chat there. You can go learn more about the celebration at that website. And you wanted to share some resources, I think, before we close.
I do, but again, wanted to say thank you both so much for your time and for answering those questions. And for everybody joining us today, there will be more webinars to come, so keep an eye out for emails with additional information. But in the meantime, I wanted to talk a bit about National Farmers Union's new job board newsletter. This is a free monthly resource that features entry-level jobs in cooperatives and the agriculture sector. And if you or someone you know is looking for a new career, we'll be putting a link in the chat to sign up for that newsletter. If you sign up, you're welcome to unsubscribe at any time. And we also, I think next slide, we would love to stay connected with all of you. So these are ways to find us online on our social media. And we're going to drop a link in the chat to our survey. We appreciate you all taking the time and letting us know how we did today, and also some of your thoughts on future webinar topics. And if you would like to stay up to date on future cooperative webinars or learn more about Farmers Union programs in your state and in your area, we encourage you to head over to nfu.org/join to learn more. So thank you again, Karen and Urban, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Emma, Lisa, and Karen. That was wonderful. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.